So, thank you for being here, Professor Keith Grint. Can I call you Professor
You
Keith
call me
Grint?
whatever you like.
I shall call you Keith, if that's all right. Cool. I want to get straight into it. I want to ask you simple question, and it does intrigue me about everyone that is interested in leadership. My first question would be to you, sir, is what made you want to study leadership?
Hmm. I think I've always had a strange relationship with authority. So I'm an army kid. My father's in the army,
Okay.
and so there was always something interesting about the way that our lives and our family life was constructed. And then I went to the boarding section of a grammar school when I was 11. Ended up getting expelled. Not because it was my. I still held to this day that it wasn't anything to do with me,
Not your
but it
fault.
was exactly. It was to do with the authority system. And I think so. Then I didn't go to university when I was 18, as I should have done, because I screwed up my A levels. Um, and then I spent about 9, 10 years in industry doing various jobs, most of them ridiculously stupid. Learned little from them. Ended up in the post office. Ended up as a trade union, full-time trade union official in the post office workers union. Then got bored at work, and then started doing an open university course, and then enjoyed that so much I hated my work. So I left the post office, went to York University to do politics, same kind of thing about where I was, but the authority issue, and then did my doctorate at Oxford. So I've always been quite interested in authority. My doctorate is on industrial relations between the wars. Um, and then when I became an academic, first teaching in Brunel University and then Oxford, um, there was an increasing demand for people who could teach something about leadership. And I could teach a little bit about leadership. And the more I taught, the more I thought at that point, there doesn't seem to be many people, if any people, in the UK. This is back in the early 1980s. I can't I couldn't think of anybody in the UK that was writing about leadership in the way that I was interested in leadership. So there were lots of Americans talking about it. They're mainly psychologists, mainly talking about business issues. I was a sociologist, political scientist, interested in issues other than business. And I think it just kind of flowed from there. So I just became interested in leadership. And then I got most of my teaching ended up in leadership. Started out kind of industrial sociology, organizational behavior, and ended up focusing on leadership because that's where the demand was, really. So I was kind of attracted to it, generally speaking, from a very early age. And the market just opened up, and I thought, well, I can make my mark in leadership studies because there isn't anybody else in the UK appearing to be studying it, not from the perspective that I was looking at anyway. So that's basically the story of my academic life.
Okay, cool, cool. Just out of interest, then. So you said that there were, and I've noticed it as well. Most people who, or most universities that offer leadership courses, they are generally to do with business. They are business related management sort of things. What did you do then that wasn't as such to do? How did you make it different to business then? I'm guessing there was a bit of military in there
Uh,
because I've seen a few of your
Yeah,
things.
I mean, I didn't do the military writing early on. That was kind of later on, but I always tried to make it fairly critical, so that when faced with a whole lot of leadership theories that I thought didn't make any kind of sense and didn't improve anything, I would say so, and I would teach them, my students, my business executives, or my students, to be critical of everything they read, including the stuff that I'd written, and to try to push that notion that even though people were suggesting there was a silver bullet route to improve your leadership potential, just follow this path. I was suggesting that the empirical data didn't actually flow from that. There was very little data to support
Yeah.
many of the claims that had been made. So I've always had a kind of critical understanding of this, and at the same time, what I wanted to do was to make sure that my teaching was viable. So I tried to fill it with lots of examples from domestic life, for example, rather than just from business examples. So I tried to make it relevant to the students. So I'd say, so here's the theory, these are the points of the theory, and this is where you might want to think about applying it when you get home. Just see if this works when you get home, and then if it does, then you know that the theory's got may have some substance to it. And if it doesn't work, then you need to remain critical and go back to the original theory and think, so where is the data supporting this argument? And can I have a look at the data? And does it make sense? And does it support whatever is being suggested in the theory?
Yeah, I've been looking at from what you're saying now. I've been looking at some of the leadership examples that I've seen. A lot of it, like you said, is business, business, business. And I've been looking at kind of this synthesizing the kind of the stereotypical leader within sport as well.
Yeah.
So you're sort of like Alex Ferguson sort of people,
Mm,
Sir Matt Busby, all those sort of people.
mm,
And then at the same time, military leaders who may not be as well known, but there are famous figures who were supposedly good at being good military leaders. And then also combining that with, like I said, business, but also you've got someone like the leader of a village or the leader of a family. So you've got someone who, I'm trying to put it all together and say, is there such a thing as a leader for specific leadership skills that you need for all of them? And then it would be maybe you need these base two or three things, and then you, depending on which area you're going in, you then need more specific leadership skills for that thing. So I'm trying to play with that a bit, because if you're only looking at sports leaders, you're probably missing a lot of vital data from military, if that makes sense. I'm probably making it way too complicated, but I do want to try and see where that goes. But do you think that there is something to be learnt from things like sporting captains, or people that have been known as leaders, and then putting all that information together? Do you think that's useful?
Yes and no. I think the problem is there have been people looking for a generalist theory of leadership since I've been reading the data, reading the
Yeah.
literature, and no one's ever come up with a generalist theory which explains everything. So I think it's probably not worth
Yet.
probably well, yeah, probably not worth pursuing that, in the sense that contextual features are so important, and
Mm.
I think a lot of this is related to the relationship aspect of leadership. So I think the focus on individual leaders in and of itself is a problem, because leaders only exist when you've got followers. So by definition,
Mm-hmm.
leadership is a relational activity. You can't be a successful leader on your own. You have to have followers. So it's not just how good you think you are, it's actually whether you have a positive relationship or a negative relationship with your followers, and what difference
Yeah.
that might make to the success. So, in terms of the contextual specifics, I think there are things that military leaders can do that sport leaders can't. So military leaders, for example, can order the execution of their followers under certain circumstances. Sport leaders are not supposed to do that. So
Supposed
there
to.
are different ways of thinking about this. The other aspect, well, there are several elements of this. One is going back to the individuals you're talking about. There's a whole body of literature called the Romance of Leadership, which is about our understanding of leaders as somehow godlike in their ability to solve all our problems. And
Mm-hmm.
yet that issue lies within us. It doesn't lie within them. So it's our problem rather than their problem. So Durkheim, French
Yeah.
sociologist, end of the 19th, early 20th century, he always talked about followers want their leaders, in any context that he's talking about. Followers want their leaders to be gods, to be godlike in their ability to solve all our problems. So your football team is
Yeah.
crap. Let's find this
The
wonderful
next manager
manager
who's
who
going to
can take
save
us from
us.
the bottom of the second
Yeah.
division to the Premiership in 4 seasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we attribute things to these great leaders. And then, because they're not gods, because they can't perform miracles, and they fail, at that point we scapegoat them. We treat them as failures. But what we don't do is realize that the problem lies within us as followers. We say that the problem lies within them. We have picked the wrong person. Let's find somebody else. But they don't pick somebody else who says, I've got a completely different approach. They pick somebody else who says, of course, I can get your division from your team from the second division to the Premiership in 4 seasons. And if someone comes up and says in the interview panel, well, I mean, looking at the state of the ground and looking at how few supporters we've got in the town, looking at the size
It's
of the
not
town,
realistic.
I think the best we could manage is possibly the first division, and that one might take us 3 seasons. In that case, people can say, well, you're no good to us. What
Yeah,
we
we don't
want is
want
someone
you.
who's
Yeah,
got
yeah, yeah, yeah.
vision
Someone who
and
tells
with
us, gives us the
confidence and who
dream.
projects all this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we end up with the wrong people in charge all the time, and then we never blame ourselves. We always blame the
For the
person.
expectations.
So this is the romance of leadership, and we're hooked into this. And I think this is
Yeah.
something which starts really early on in our lives. And I think as children, we kind of attribute to our parents this godlike ability to solve all our problems. And then when we realize, you know what, our parents don't know everything, they can't solve all our problems, we think, well, I better find somebody who can, rather than say, no, it's up to me now to sort my life out. So I think we have this model in our head of leadership, which is locked into this romance of the individual hero, which is in itself a significant problem. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you don't need heroes. And that's where I get to my main argument, which is you need more than leadership. You need command and you need management. So command is what you need when you've got in a crisis. You need someone to say, okay, the hotel is on fire. I don't want you to think about this in your little tables to discuss what counts as a fire or what we should be doing. I'm telling you, get the hell out of the
Let's go.
hotel. And then later on, when we come back into the hotel, somebody will say, I don't know if you know, Keith, but that's the 4th fire alarm we've had this week. I said, oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Anybody know why we keep having fire alarms? Nobody knows. Okay, so now we've switched from a critical problem, there might well be a fire, get out, to a wicked problem because nobody knows why we keep getting these problems. We need to have a conversation about this. Now, at that point, somebody in the room will say, just a second, Keith, this morning you were telling us what to do, and now you're asking for our help. You're completely inconsistent. I like consistency amongst my leaders. Actually, I don't. I like inconsistency between different categories of problem. But if you don't have the same language, then you can't do this. So the whole point of the wicked, tame, critical problems, management, leadership, and command is about having a similar language so you can explain to people, this is a critical problem. I'm not interested in what you're saying. Get out. Or, this is a wicked problem. I need your help. Or, this is a management problem. You know what to do. You've been taught by the organization to go and do this. Take some responsibility and go and fix it. So I think you need to be able to move up and down this ladder of different decision styles to be able to make the most of this contingency, which is always in front of you. So rather than thinking about, is it just sports or military or business, I actually think those models cut across all of those 3. So, for example, if your team is 6-0 down at half time, you probably need to get a bit tough with them. But if your team is, hovering and it's 1-1, maybe you need to start thinking about something else. And if your team is consistently losing, then you might think about, this is a wicked problem now. There is something wrong with this club, and I need your help to get us out of this hole. So there's no point in me shouting at you anymore because we've lost the last 6 games. We lost them 5-0 each time. There is something deeply wrong with this. Let's take a day out and try to work out what is going wrong and what we might collectively do. So that at this point, you're kind of abandoning the leadership model about me being in charge of everything and saying this is a collective problem. I can't solve your problem, but I can help you fix it. But we need to work together. So I think you need to be able to get beyond the leadership model to be able to cope with this diversity of problems that comes across your desk if you are the decision maker.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That is fascinating. I as you were saying that, you reminded me of a couple of things actually. I remember I did an interview with someone ex-military 2 years ago, and I asked him. It was leadership questions, and I asked him. Imagine you were in a hotel, and a crisis happened, and you're stood there in this hotel, and just say it came under attack from you don't know who, and within that hotel, as soon as you hear gunshots going off, you look around you and there are three other military people with you, all from different countries, and none of you speak the same language. How do you deal with that situation? I said, do you take control? I said, how do you become? What do you do? Because you've got no verbal now. Is it tone? Do you try and use sign language? And he was just like, I don't know. And then I said to him, because in that situation, after he kind of finished talking, I said to him, surely it would be, in that case, a lead by example. And people kind of go, I know what's going on. So it would be, instead of talking, it would be lead by example and go, which is, for me, the difference between a manager, you do this, you do this, you do this, and a leader, which is, this is what's happening, and people in that moment go, aha, we're just going to go that way. Kind of like the silverback. And I know that's kind of going a little bit animalistic, but the silverback does something and everyone just goes, oh, we're going to do that as well. So it's kind of like you're saying about the followers. I did want to say something else about the followers, actually, when you were saying about people following the wrong leaders all the time. I see that a lot of politicians get voted in, and they are essentially the same every time. It's just a remold of the same person, essentially. And it's because it's safe in what you know, potentially. But what I've noticed with a lot of these people that are following them is they are, if you look at them and you listen to them, they are the best salesmen. So these people have been voted in by their peers as the best figurehead, the most attractive figurehead, to get their team to beat the other team, whether it be whichever country it is in. Whereas if you're in a business, a corporate environment, usually you are voted up by the people above you, whereas in politics you are voted up by the people below you. So your followers in a political situation are the people you kind of need to win over as a salesman, whereas if you're voted in from above, it's usually from, in most cases, it's you're non-threatening to those people, and then it's your job to win over your followers after you've been put in that position. And I find that fascinating. But do you think that makes a difference? Do you think that makes a difference as to whether you are kind of like in the book The Prince, where by Machiavelli, where you get put into that role, or you take over that role, or you inherit that role? But yeah, what's your opinion on that in like today's world? If that makes a difference, do you think?
There's lots in that. The first thing is to think about.
Sorry.
There's a lot of research on people's attractiveness, and that's why people support them, either physical attractiveness or facial features or height, good looks. All of that stuff makes a big difference in terms of the way that people are attracted to them. The first thing. The second thing is there's also a lot of processes and structures involved. So the fact that we get particular politicians in charge of us doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most popular, because the first past the post system means it doesn't. Well, I mean, we've not had a majority government, i.e., voted in by the majority of the population, since the Second World War. So it's not about the majority of followers following people. That what they're working with is a system which is, are you more popular than the next party, as opposed to do you get the most votes?
Who's least bad?
Pardon?
Who's least bad?
Yeah, no, there is an argument that that's what happens. So there's all kinds of aspects of that in terms of that. But it goes back to the previous point you made, which is about safety. I think by and large, what people want is to feel that the person in charge of them is knowledgeable, confident, and knows what they're doing. Whether that is the case or not is a separate issue.
Yeah, they just
but
want to feel it.
we don't follow people who say, do you know what, this is a really complex issue. I'm not sure I've got the answer to your problem. This is really difficult. I mean, I'll try my best, but I don't know whether I can fix it. So, for example, if I'm standing for politics and I say, do you know what, let's think about the social care problem we've got in this country, which we've had for generations now. I mean, Boris Johnson said on day one, he had a plan to fix it and it was already fixed. That's a complete lie, as usual. So if I came up on board and said, right, I want to be the leader of this country, let's try and fix the social care problem. It is so complex. I don't have an answer to it. But what I'd like to do is organize lots of groups, and together we might be able to make some difference to this and might make it less significant. As opposed to Boris comes in and says, no, I know how to fix it. I've got a plan. It's already done. It'll be working in 12 months. Who are you going to vote for, me or Boris? Well, it's going to be Boris because you think he's got the answer. The fact that he doesn't, it's too late by the time you voted him in. What you don't want is someone who says, oh, this is really complex. I think there's a difference between politicians and academics, or consultants and academics. Academics say, "Oh, this is really complicated. I'm not sure about this." And consultants and political leaders say, "I know exactly what the answer is. Here it is. Follow these 4 things. I guarantee you we will be successful." And then 12 months down the line, if I'm a consultant, I've gone to a different job. If I'm a politician, I've been removed anyway. And someone comes along and says, "Oh, let's try somebody else. They seem to have the answer."
Yeah.
And we never look in the mirror and think this is something to do with me. We voters are the problem here. We supporters are the problem. We have to rethink this. So when someone tells you bad news, take it on the chin and say, you're right. I think I do need to pay more taxes. But I think this is an important part of leadership. Leadership is about disappointing people at a rate they can manage. There's Ronnie Heifetz's phrase a long time ago. And that thing about telling people truths that they don't want to hear is probably the most important aspect of leadership. But it's the thing that gets you fired or not elected. Telling people things they don't want to hear.
I did say to I taught a lesson last week, and I said to them that for me the most important aspect of being a manager or a leader, because I believe that they are 2 completely different things, which is a whole other conversation. I said to them, I think the number 1 key to your own personal success, I mean, depending on what the definition of success may be, is management of expectation. If you manage your boss's expectation, your client's expectation, your students, your family, managing that expectation will, in a clever way, not kind of like you said, saying, well, we're not going to be able to do it, but I remember I had a boss years ago, and he said to me, I want this done by Friday. And I said, I will do everything I can. I will try my best to get it done by Friday. And he went, no, I want it done by Friday. And we went round in circles with me going, I'm not guaranteeing you that. I will do everything in my power. And I guarantee you there is no one else on the planet that will get as close to it being done if I don't get it done. So I had the confidence, but I'm not going to say to him it's definitely going to get done, because we don't know what's going to happen. I will not give that guarantee. And it infuriated him, but I'm not guaranteeing it. So I think managing that expectation is I think you've got to be pretty clever about that. Because like you say, if you say, no, I can't do that, then I think, like you said, people lose faith. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you actually, something that's fascinating me at the moment is your letter to Putin article. It was about the mutiny, and I wanted to ask you about that, and if you feel any different about it now with everything that's going on, or whether that strengthened your opinion of the article. So just can you quickly just give a brief overview of what you wrote?
Yeah. So one of the things we know from academic articles is they probably take a couple of years to come out. And by the time they've come out, the thing that you were talking about has probably gone. So, so that the leadership, the journal Leadership, the Sage Journal, which I and David Collinson started 20 years ago. One of the things we've tried to do is have a little area where you can write something quite quickly, which is relevant to contemporary politics or whatever it happens to be. So. Just after the mutiny, since I just published a book on mutiny a year beforehand, I thought it'd be interesting to write something about the way that mutiny operates in Russia in this particular case, and try to think about, first of all, making it somewhat satirical, and also to make it relevant to what was likely to happen in the future. So it starts out by using Machiavelli's argument about not relying on mercenaries. So Machiavelli's
Yeah.
big big problem in what we now call Italy is the reliance by princes on those kinds of mercenary armies, which had only one interest, and that was to make money. So if somebody was to pay them more, they'd go to the other side. So Machiavelli's argument: you've got to get beyond this and start recruiting civilians from your own population. Anyway, so Putin clearly hadn't understood Machiavelli, because this is exactly what he did to fight the war in Ukraine, is to recruit mercenaries. And the consequence of recruiting the Wagner group was almost inevitable, that at some point it would find itself in a position um, led by Prigozhin, and at that point there would be a mutiny. So the mutiny was kind of written in the cards from day one. The fact that it didn't actually go anywhere was partly because it was kind of a small and disorganized, and Prigozhin was never really a great military leader or political leader, and partly because he kind of didn't do it in a full-blooded way. He didn't have any allies in the main Russian forces, and he got so far within 24 hours he changed his mind and went back to where he was. And Machiavelli would have warned him that if you draw your sword against your prince, you must throw away the scabbard. And that's what he didn't do. He put the sword back in the scabbard and ended up crashing in an aeroplane, and his group was dissipated across the country. So I think there are arguments from that mutiny, which is about, when you do that, when you do make that final decision. First of all, historically, we know there aren't that many mutinies, and secondly, the ones that work are the ones that are A, well organized, and B, have a lot of allies in conventional forces. So, for example, the 1917 Russian mutiny of the Russian army in the First World War was supported by a lot of people, including by the Bolshevik Party at the time. And that level of support basically meant that the Russians fell away from the First World War. They just basically withdrew and then organized a peace treaty once the Bolsheviks had taken over. So that mutiny was widespread and well organized and well supported, in complete contrast to the Wagner Group mutiny. So if Prigozhin had known something about mutinies, he would never have done it in the first place in the way that he did it. So it's a kind of argument that you can learn stuff from history. I think that's the main point I'm trying to make here, is that there are lots of historical examples of precisely similar things, not the same thing, similar things to what you're looking at. And if you look hard enough, you can see how they work. So mutinies are very difficult to organize because the penalties for mutinies are horrendous. I mean, the penalties for organizing a strike or leaving your place of work or being sick or going late are minimal. But most mutinies ended up with somebody being shot. So there is something in here about the difference in terms of the leadership mechanisms in a mutiny versus leadership mechanisms in a business or even in the military itself. They are very different. In a mutiny, the leaders have, the big problem is conspiracy. How can you trust people? How can you say to people, by tomorrow morning, we're all going to stop doing this, if you think they're going to reveal everything to the hierarchy? So it's almost always it starts out with a very small number of people. And it's a really difficult, probably the most difficult form of leadership to do is to lead a mutiny. And then in the book, there are lots of examples of mutinies, but I think it kind of ends up with a chapter at the very end, which is about, so why would you lead a mutiny? What kinds of people would do this, knowing that your chances of success are really quite small? And even if the mutiny does succeed, somebody will come and get you at some point. It kind of runs back into some more contemporary 1960s, 1970s work by people like Milgram and Zimbardo with their experiments, who suggested that if you put people in certain situations to do terrible things to ordinary people, then probably 2/3 of the population would comply, and 1/3 of the population would not comply. And I think that notion of a minority resistance also flows into the book that I've just published, which is about resistance, which looks at resistance across all kinds of resistance to Rome, resistance in the Second World War, all kinds of resistance features. And all of those are based on the same premise that the people that resist, however horrendous the oppression, only a minority of people ever get involved in resisting. And sometimes they have good reasons not to resist. I've got a family to look after. I don't want to get involved in this. If I get murdered or imprisoned, then my family's stuffed. So I'm not going to bother. But there are always some people that do resist, and it's always a minority. And yet, towards the end of the resistance, so for example, let's take resistance in France or in Holland, in the Netherlands, in the Second World War, right at the very end of the resistance, which until that point is undertaken by a minority of people, right at the very end, loads of people get involved in the resistance, and that allows the political leaders to say, do you know what? I know we were occupied for so many years, but look at how we escaped from the occupation. The whole population became heroic, and we heroically threw the Germans out. This is a complete fabrication, because there was only ever a minority, and the Germans were thrown out by the Allied forces, not by the resistance forces. But that plays to a political ideal, which is you don't want to finish up the end of the war saying, we didn't do very well, did we? I mean, most of us were cowards, for whether that might have been a good reason or not. We didn't do very much. What you want is to be able to say, we finished the war and we ended up as a heroic nation. We freed ourselves from this oppression. So it doesn't really matter what actually happens on the ground. What matters is what you make of it and how you construct this. So a lot of my arguments about the so-called social construction of leadership, where people construct narratives and stories about what they did, so it looks like they played the heroic mode. I mean, Trump is an arch principle of this. He constructs stories in his head about how the election was stolen from him, how getting 77 million votes was whatever it was better than getting 85 million votes for some reason, and how he's a billionaire with loads of cash, but now he can't afford to pay the criminal damages that he's been required to pay. And these are all narratives in his head, and they play to a certain group. They play to the MAGA constituency, which says what we want is a hero who says to us, I feel your pain and I know how to fix it. The way to fix it is, first of all, to elect me. I will become dictator. I will get rid of loads of Latinos. I will shut the border. I will make America great. I mean, all of this is fabricated lies, but it plays to their desires to be led by somebody who appears to have an easy answer to a very complex problem. And so I think in some ways, Trump is a classic example of this romantic mode of leadership, where you generate narratives that appeal to your followers. Whether they're true or not is virtually irrelevant.
Yeah, I did find it fascinating when you had Trump and Boris Johnson essentially ruling the world. I thought this has got to be some sort of comedy sketch, because those two combined.
Well,
But
they're not alone, of course, to get Bolsonaro in Brazil.
he was lunatic.
We're into the land of kind of right-wing populists at the moment, and I don't know where it's going. But if Trump gets in again, then I think
that direction.
It's game up. Yeah.
Yeah. I did want to. I get something you were talking about a minute ago about when you were saying about Second World War. I did read. Actually, yesterday I read a quick article on Hitler and how. One of the things that was part of his downfall was the fact that he was so distrustful of everyone. He ended up trying to play everyone against everyone else because he just didn't trust anyone, and then it ended up making everyone distrustful of him, and he got really paranoid, and he ended up not being able to trust anyone, and then sending units to their death because he didn't like them, and he was just went a bit mental in the end because of that whole trust thing and thinking that people were trying to kill him. And don't get me wrong, most of the world was, but you can understand why a man might go a little bit paranoid. But I tell you, that's something. I know that's hours and hours of conversation on this one question alone. But I was just wondering then, as you were saying it about the World War II, when people say about leadership, they say what the definition of leadership is, and good leadership. I think this is another issue I'm finding is what you class as good leadership. Is it someone who is successful? Is it longevity? Is it the person who builds an empire, and while that empire is growing, they are incredibly good at growing that place to a place of peace, and then they die just as they achieve that, and then their son takes over and all they do is not mess it up, and then he gets all the praise as he's the great leader when all he's done is just not mess it up. So it's kind of your definition of what a great leader is. But a lot of people have said about Hitler was evil, and the things he did were unforgivable, but have you looked at the Hitler as a leader and saw, like, I mean, obviously he had quite a lot of charisma to his people. Do you think that he was a not necessarily military tactician, but do you think he was a good leader in terms of political? Do you think he had a lot of those traits that a lot of what you would call, I suppose, powerful leaders have got?
I think perhaps the problem is the word good. If you take the word good out and put successful in, then I think we can agree that Hitler was a successful leader in the early part of the 1930s and from 1933 onwards. And I think one of the reasons he's successful is because he, like Trump, he provides a really simple answer to a really complex problem. So what has gone wrong with Germany after the Second World War? Well, to Hitler, and the story is it's really about being stabbed in the back by Jews and Bolsheviks. So if we can get rid of both of that lot, so let's get rid of the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, get rid of the Jews, everything will be absolutely wonderful. So he provides this really simple answer to a complex problem in the way that Trump does exactly the same narrative approach. I mean, the second thing is that Hitler is successful really until 1941, and the invasion of Russia goes wrong. And one of the reasons it goes wrong is because the military is overconfident. They think it will be over in a few weeks, and it's not. It lasts forever. So that issue then becomes he stops allowing a degree of decentralized control by his military leaders at that point when it starts to go wrong in Russia. He takes over control, and from that point onwards, it goes wrong because he's not a military strategist, he's not a tactician, he's just a political leader. And because of that, everything goes wrong simultaneously, and it ends up in the mess that it ended up with. That issue of trying to think about the relationship between followers and leaders. So the first part of the Second World War is very successful for the Germans because it's not led by Hitler. He's the political leader, but the military leaders are doing all the work, and it's very much decentralized to them, and then it stops. In Napoleon's case, it's almost very similar. So the early part of Napoleon's career, when he's very successful, he is listening to his generals. And then at some point, he stops listening to the generals. And as soon as he stops listening to them and believes himself to be the immortal God, as soon as that happens, defeat stares him in the face because he's no longer relying upon this relationship, this feedback from his followers. He's just telling them what to do. He's not listening to them. Churchill is very similar. So Churchill, in the beginning of the Second World War, and before he becomes Prime Minister, he's in charge of the Admiralty. And he doesn't like the way that the Navy is starting to protect convoys from America. They're protecting convoys. He doesn't think that's aggressive enough. So he orders the Admiralty to abandon the convoy system and start searching out for U-boats individually. This is a much more aggressive, masculine approach to warfighting. It's a catastrophe. Churchill is not a strategist. It doesn't work. We lose hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. And then, fortunately, Churchill becomes Prime Minister, leaves the Navy, they revert back to their convoy system, and that's basically how the convoy system works, because it's a protective system. Then when he becomes Prime Minister, I think he begins to learn that he can't do it on his own. So, for example, his war cabinet is full of people that don't like him and don't think like him. His most important military advisor is Allen. And I think what he does with him is listens to him. And if you read any of Allenby's diaries, he talks all the time about how Churchill is trying to do something really stupid again, but Allenby talks him out of it. So, for example, when we're coming up to D-Day, so 1944, even a few months before D-Day, Churchill is saying, "No, I don't think we should do this because we're going to lose the flower of British youth. Will be lost on the beaches of France. So let's find something else to do." And Allenby dissuades him from doing this, and then the D-Day is successful. So I think what Churchill does is start out being this narcissistic, charismatic leader, but then realizes he can't do this stuff properly. So he is forced to listen to subordinates, followers who are better skilled at the things that he can't do. So that enables him to become a successful political leader. And I think that's the problem with a lot of political leaders, is that over time you become corrupt. Your success corrupts you, and you end up
Also, your
thinking,
ego.
I'm the only person that knows the answer to this problem. So I'll just recruit people that look and sound like me, and I'll listen to nobody. And that is the fatal flaw, I think, for most leaders. That
Yeah.
that corruption that comes in with power, and you have to be able to recruit people that you don't like and don't say the same things as you. But it's a really tough thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry, as well, corruption of your own ego, I think, as well. Because if you start off with a good mind and you end up like Trump, you're going to land in a big explosion, I think. But I got a little I suppose story I wanted to run past you, which I read to. I kind of made it up, little example, and I read it to some students, and I asked them about it a few days ago, and it was a few weeks ago probably, but it was about Churchill actually, and it was I can't see that, Keith. Okay, cool. Yeah, it was about Churchill, and it was essentially, the war happened. Now imagine you had, let's just say, Churchill was locked in a tower, but no one knew this, and he was a shivering wreck, and he had no confidence, and all someone did was write scripts for him, and he was a very good actor, and he'd stand in front of the camera and kind of deliver this speech, and then he'd go back into being a shivering wreck again, and everyone believed that he was this great leader, so everyone followed Churchill, and they united the country. So you galvanised the country, you galvanised everyone together. But what if they were following this fictitious character? So would that then, I mean, that technically there is no leader, but you've created a followership of this false thing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, isn't it? The wizard in the Wizard of Oz, just a
Yes,
little old man who's pulling
exactly that.
strings, but everybody believes him to be fantastically successful. So I think that's the image that you're thinking about, or Orwell's 1984, when all you hear is
Yeah,
these messages from people that you never see, that everything is going well in the war, and wheat surpluses are massive. So I think that notion is important. One way of capturing it is almost to reverse it. So when one of the things that Hitler was most successful at was public speaking. He had a way of galvanizing people through public speaking.
yeah,
And we know that he only ever made one public speech on German radio in the Second World War. And it didn't go down very well. And he never repeated it. And he didn't repeat it because he didn't have the audience in front of him. He couldn't feed off their energy. And he was a speaker that needed to feed off the energy of the people in front of him. A bit like Trump. And you see him just whistles on about God knows what, and his followers appear to love him. And I think Hitler is a bit like that. He feeds off their energy. And once you put him off that stage, then he loses it. He can't do it anymore. And I think that kind of plays into what you were just talking about, this notion of, but it's almost like, if you know anything about the end of the Second World War in Japan. So in theory, the Japanese emperor is the head of state. In practice, It's really the military which are in control of everything. But when it comes to the surrender, a lot of people won't surrender unless they hear the Japanese emperor on the radio. Now, most people have never seen him in Japan, and they've never heard his voice. So he comes on the radio and basically says things have not turned out very well, as opposed to we need to surrender. But what is intriguing is that, first of all, people didn't recognize some of the language he uses because it's a really peculiar form of Japanese. And secondly, they've never heard him before. So they're lost at the beginning to think about, is this really the emperor?
Is this real?
And
Yeah.
then when they are persuaded it is the emperor, then they begin to surrender. So there's something here about you can have this extraordinary role in the background. Nobody sees you, nobody hears you, but you play this symbolic role, which is really important. I think religions embody exactly that. You have this symbolic god or gods, whichever religion you follow, which you never see, you never actually hear. There's no empirical evidence of them, but they play a massive part in your life if you're a believer. So the fact that you're not
Yeah.
there in a physical manifestation doesn't necessarily mean you're not extraordinarily significant. So leadership
Yeah.
is much
Fascinating.
more than just this person coming on TV and ranting at you. It's way more important than that, which goes back to the follower thing. Unless you can understand why followers follow, you can't explain leadership.
Do you know what? I want to end it there because I think that was an amazing point, and I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you. But that was pretty amazing, super insightful. So thank you again for your time. I would love, 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 love to have you again at some point. And there are lots of different things that I've written down that I'd love to talk to you about. D-Day is massively one of them, and your basically everything that I know. You've written quite a few things about D-Day in the military, and I'd love to pick your brains a bit more about that and a few other things as well. But I've definitely taken up enough of your time today, so thank you, thank you. And I did want to say as well, if you said that you've just published another book. What book's that?
This is a book. It's about resistance and leadership, management and command. It's I've got a copy of it somewhere. No, I haven't. It's called A Cartography of Resistance. So it's a kind of it's a mapping exercise. It's looking across. It starts out in Rome, looking at resistance to Rome. So people like Boudica, for example. Um, then it moves to different forms of resistance to slavery in America, and not in America, in Haiti and in the West Indies. And then it looks at resistance in work, looking at the match girls, so-called match girls strike, looking at the post office between the wars. And then I'm looking at two aspects from the Second World War: resistance of the Germans to Hitler during the Second World War, and resistance of the Dutch to the German invasion. And then there's chapters on resistance to black aviators in the Second World War and women aviators in the Second World War. And it ends up with a chapter on Malaysia, so the so-called Malayan emergency, and finishes off with Iraq, the recent invasion of Iraq. And the final bit is really reversing it and just looking at what are the rhetorical tropes, the kind of arguments that people that resist the resistance, what kind of arguments do they make about why the resistance is invalid and shouldn't be supported. So that's coming out in a couple of months' time, I think, Oxford University Press.
Well, I'll be getting myself a copy of that. And what was the name of it one more time?
It's
What was the
called
name of it
it's
one more
called
time?
A Cartography of Resistance: Leadership, Management, and Command.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Professor Keith. And like I said, if I'd love to speak to you again sometime.
Sure.
If
Yeah,
that's
we'll
possible.
organise that. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been amazing.
Okay. Thanks. Bye bye.